Hello and welcome to the latest of our series on guided reading. I am Debra Crouch and I am excited that you're here with me. I hope everybody's doing well with being home and practicing social distancing and all of the things that go with where we are today in our world. So we'll get started right away here so that we can think together about guided reading. And so let me do all of the clicking, all of the sharing that needs to occur, and here you can see my screen and we'll get started right here. So guided reading, today we're going to focus on lessons with early readers. So today's thinking will look at students who are working in kindergarten through second grade, and thinking about what does guided reading look like for these students. And so we think about the work, again, looking across reading development in a continuum. This reading development chart is going to be something I'm going to refer to quite frequently through today to talk about our readers. And so if you don't have that, go ahead and see if you can get that printed off the Okapi website. So the webinar series up to this point, we have had 3 sessions that were K-5. And they're all available at myokapi.com under Literacy Voices with a tab called Webinars. And so you'll be able to find all of these that we've recorded so far. So 3 that were K-5. And then we began to look at these reading stage grade-specific sessions. So last time we were together, we looked at emergent kindergarten and first grade readers. And one of the things I shared last week, if you saw that session, is that one of the things that we're going to do is create a different webinar for for looking at students when we're in those very first lessons with our youngest learners. That it's amazing how big that span is in kindergarten and first grade when you start looking at those emergent readers. So we're going to be creating a webinar specifically about students in those first lessons. Then the other thing to think about is, if there are other sessions that you are interested in us creating webinars for, would you drop Pat Eastman an email at pat@myokapi.com and let her know some of the topics that you think would be really helpful for you as you are thinking about the work. And I think, there's no silver lining to this situation that we're all in right now. I do think it gives us some opportunities to catch up on all of our professional learning. So I guess that's the way a lot of us are looking at it. So today we're going to focus on early readers in kindergarten through second grade. The 3 questions that we'll think about: 1, what does guided reading lesson design look like when you're working with students in these early stages of reading? And how does the teacher facilitate? And what happens after the lesson, after we read a book in guided reading? So using those 3 questions to guide our thinking, we're going to think a little bit first, just reviewing quickly some of the things that we've talked about in the other sessions. This is when we define guided reading, thinking about students with the support of the teacher, reading, thinking, and talking their way purposefully through a text, and helping children to use strategies that are already known to read an unfamiliar text independently with success. So today's work, when we think about the space of the work on the continuum here, we're going to look at kids who are reading in books at levels E and F, at G and H, and I and J. So thinking across this early span. This is oftentimes thought of as all of those levels that our first grade readers are going across, but we know that kindergartners can easily move into these levels, and we'll even have second graders, also even third graders, who are reading in these stages as well. So as we're talking and thinking here together. So when you think about the text that kids are starting to encounter in these levels, one of the things to think about is how the texts are created to support some of the reading behaviors that are on that reading development chart. So when you're in texts that are at levels E and F, one of the things that you'll see is that more of the ideas are found in the print of the text. So our students are less dependent on illustrations and photographs to make sense of the ideas or the story that they're reading. And that really supports kids as they are using the text as well as the pictures to recall and predict the story. and then how they're using the illustrations and photographs to support inferential thinking, as opposed to necessarily some of that literal information. And then um, helping kids to use the pictures to monitor and confirm what they're reading in the words that they're finding. And then one of the other things you start seeing in these levels is these extended sentence structures. There are lots of prepositional phrases and clauses that you find. So the sentences themselves have gotten longer with more complexity. So the lexically dense kind of sentences you find in nonfiction are there. One of the things that that's going to do is support kids as they continue to read on to make sure that they're making sense out of what they're reading. In level E, one of the things that you'll see in these books is that anytime there is a new sentence, it begins on the left. So you will not have "this is a plum tree" and then many animals continuing on the same line. When we go to a new sentence, it drops back down to the left, so that the students are supported to make meaning of those texts, but they don't have to deal with quite so much punctuation. But when you move over into F, in level F, you start to see that the sentences continue on a line. So, for example, in the book page that you see here, sometimes nets are put over plants and trees. This stops the bats from eating the plants and the trees. That second sentence begins on the same line. And you see a use of space there to support kids to notice that gap, that space that comes after a period in the same line. All of that is to support kids as they are developing their abilities with fluency and phrasing. You'll see varieties of punctuation here, commas, periods. So the kids are having to cope with that simple punctuation. But one of the things that is also here to support kids is that you still see phrasings kept together. So, for example, at the top or in the level F book, this stops the bats from eating, and there's plenty of room on that line to add the plants, but the plants and trees is one phrase, and so that is kept together on a line to support phrasing. You'll see in these levels that a lot more complex ideas are being represented. So when kids are reading in fiction, they're able to discuss the characters, the actions, the feelings across a text. In nonfiction, discussing information across books, across the book, excuse me, to get to some of those bigger ideas that are there. So one of the things that you'll see is that the kids are really having a lot more complex text to actually challenge them in making those bigger meanings as they read the text. In transition text, in these transitional levels, G and H, we begin to see that the texts are no longer just about like typically known ideas. Here they're going to be experiencing ideas that are beyond what they are thinking about in their own lives. So in nonfiction, you begin to see an increase in the graphics that are added to support meaning. And one of the things that you see is that all of the ideas are not just in the words. There are ideas that are found in the photographs and the labels and the other graphics that are provided. And so that supports kids to really have to use the visual supports along with the print to be able to get to those, comprehend those fuller meanings that are there. When they're working in fiction, there'll be multiple characters beginning to appear across stories, and that supports kids as, again, as they're learning to discuss the relationships between characters. Again, extended sentences, varied punctuation, and so it supports kids as they are learning to always think about, does it make sense? Does it look right? Does it sound right? Because that integration is going to be really key and important here. One of the things that they also start happening as they move in these early and transitional stages is that the vocabulary and the multisyllabic words that are beginning to appear really require the kids to search for chunks and patterns in text. They can't rely on just the beginning sounds to help them figure out words. And then finally, another stage in this early collection here is looking at text at I and J, and here you begin to see the real full variety of text types that you'll see that it's really going to necessitate that kids are reading with fluency and comprehension to be able to integrate all of the ideas that are they're finding across the text to get to bigger meanings. In fiction, for example, in this book, this is from level I text. It's from a page in Gasari's Herd. And you begin to see these richer characters. They have a lot more meaningful events and settings, and again, removed from that personal experience. And that allows the students to develop that ability to really think about how the different aspects of a fiction text are linked and connected. And in nonfiction, these topics, you're also going to start seeing sometimes a mix of text types. So you might find, for example, in this book about rescue, that there's not only the informational text like the page you see here, but there's some biographical information about one of the subjects, one of the firefighters in the book. You'll also see that there's an increase in the graphics that are here. So one of the things that kids are really learning in these particular levels is to firm up how you extract information from the informational passages, but also integrate in what you're learning from the text and the graphics. And so that they're able to again build meanings across the text. These texts are longer, so they're typically chapter books, short chapters, and so it gives kids opportunities to use chapter headings to prepare for reading. Doing that kind of work. Multisyllabic words are much more common here, and so the kids are going to have to do a lot of word work here to think about getting into, like in Gasari's Herd, there are words like fearless and brave and adventurous. And the kids have to learn how to cope with texts like this. In nonfiction, they're beginning to use these very subject-specific kinds of vocabulary like siren and rescue and flames. And they have to do a lot of work to figure out some of those kinds of work. But one of the other things that layers in an additional challenge here is that we no longer see phrases being held together. So in the earlier levels, you saw the phrasings always together to support fluency in phrasing. Here, we want kids to experience it and develop the ability to what's called managing the line breaks, so that when phrases are broken, the kids don't insert punctuation into their voices. They wrap the text and know that it continues on to the next line. So when kids are encountering all of these kinds of challenges in text, our work is just making sure that kids understand that everything that's happening in those texts and the way that they're processing involves comprehension. So what does guided reading look like when you're in texts of this complexity? What does it look like? So in guided reading, we are going to think about an introduction as a way of supporting kids to understand what the work is that comes up. One of the things that we talked about in our very first guided reading webinar is that guided reading has to incorporate a lot of discussion. And one of the things we know is that if kids are going to learn how to work in discussions, and it has to be something that's taught, it has to be something that's continually supported if kids are going to be able to apply that kind of learning. And so when they're working in the introduction or we're in an introduction, one of the things we want to do as teachers is to set up the talk work, set up the collaboration work that kids are going to be going through and working with. We're also going to be setting up the reading work. So we're thinking about what is it that kids are going to be taking on and trying on as they're applying all those strategies that they already know. And we have to introduce them to the ideas that are there in the book. Sometimes people call that a picture walk. I think of it more as a book walk if we're doing that. But in these levels, one of the things you'll see in the video that you're getting ready to watch is that we ask kids to do that introduction, that book walk, for themselves, because at this point we want them to be able to introduce the text to themselves. So we have an introduction piece of time in the lesson structure. Then we move into our reading and discussing, and that's where students are leading the discussion and reading that text independently for themselves. And the teacher's role becomes one of facilitation and checking for understanding, and then making sure that at the end of the lesson that we have a closure. And I always say teachers tell me their secret here is that oftentimes we don't have a closure in our lessons. We're constantly running late or constantly thinking about the next group that's coming. But one of the things we know is that we want closure in a lesson to provide the opportunity for us to stop and reflect on what's going on in that lesson that's to support that learner. All right, so let me set you up a little bit for the group that you're going to see. All right, these kiddos, it's a group of first graders. It's the end of the year, first grade. And you'll see there's me in the center, and then you see the kids sitting around the table. We have Santiago. Santiago is an English learner. Spanish is his first language. Next to him is Christine, and Christine's name is spelled correctly. It does have an S on the end. Christine is also, I believe, an English learner as well. Ahmed is next to him, Corbin, Jocelyn, and then Aiden. And so this group of kids you're going to see working and thinking together around a text. And the week before I worked with the kids, we had worked with some other texts. And so one of the things I was doing was keeping track of some of the things that they already did when they got into text. And so I created this chart for us, and it was up as we were having our lesson. And some of the things we talked about that we did to understand nonfiction, and the kids said it made the book easy, was using photographs to help us figure out some words and ideas. Really making sure that we're thinking about what the words mean, not just saying the words. Looking carefully at the words for parts and letters that we know, and then putting the words and pictures together to understand the ideas, as well as noticing patterns in the book to help us figure out big ideas and the main idea of the text. Kids added that part in. They said, we're learning about main idea. I said, so let's add that to our thinking here. So these were some of the things that they were already doing. So as we came into this work, these students are in this transitional stage of reading. And so some of the things that they were doing as text decoders, these were kids that had a lot of known words. So a lot of, fairly reading fluently and with phrasing as they would read it together. They used their knowledge of punctuation to read fluently and meaningfully. And one of the things that we were working on was when we got to some of those larger multisyllabic words, of what kinds of things do we do to solve those words. So things like searching and using chunks in the word, and then looking at how words remind us of other words and noticing words in different places. So the kids were really strong about and are approximating in doing that work as well. So as meaning makers, they were really thinking a lot about the text to confirm predictions and integrating meaning structure and visual, and really using the visuals to support their thinking. And then they were also learning to discuss important ideas from these informational texts and build meaning across the text. That's something that they were approximating towards. So the text that they're reading in the book, or in the video, is a book called Clever Tales. And it is a book about how different animals use their tails to get food, which really fascinates the kids. And so it's one of those just gloriously inviting books to get kids to think a lot about what they're reading. And this particular reading stage requires, and text level, requires kids to integrate information they're getting from the visuals as well as the text and putting those together, because the information they're finding out from the photographs is not actually found in the words themselves. And so you'll see the kids beginning to have that conversation about what they're learning from the photograph and integrating that in with what they're learning. We're not going to watch the entire video, but one of the things, if you go back and watch the entire thing yourself, is you'll see there's some confusion about this page. So this jaguar page. And so you'll see that the kids are really working hard to make meaning around this particular text. So I've divided the video clips into the introduction, read, discuss, and closure. And so what we'll do is we'll watch the introduction, stop and process that. We'll watch reading and discussing, stop and process that, and then look at the closure. So here we go with our introduction.
So I have a new book for us today. Okay.
Tales.
It is. It's called Clever Tales. You noticed it on the back of the book the other day, and you wanted to read that. So before we start in with this book, now, one of the things that we're thinking about to make our group really, really strong is to make sure that we hear all the different ideas that everybody's sharing. So today, when you're talking and sharing out your idea, make sure that you're putting your thinking out there. And if two people start talking at once, what kind of things can you do to help that? What could you do?
Push back.
So just wait. So you hold back and wait and let someone else, and then you'll have time to share your thinking too, okay? So we'll all have time to share our thinking. So this book's called Clever Tales. You saw that the other day. Why do you think that animals have tails? Think for a moment. Remember, you don't have to put your hands up, to just put your hand, but do some thinking. Why do you think animals have tails? Ahmed, you want to start us off? Why do you think animals have tails?
I think animals have tails, so sometimes their tails help, because sometimes when they fall, an animal can grab their tail, or sometimes like snakes have their tails and they shake and it says back off.
So talk to us, Aiden.
I know something about cheetahs from the dogs. They both chase their tails.
So sometimes they use their tail as something to play with. In this book, in this particular book, this is a report, and it's going to tell us about how some animals use their tails to get food.
What?
Yeah.
I'm so confused with this.
That sounds confusing, doesn't it? Now, have you ever heard the word clever before?
Like,
What popped in your head when you heard the word clever? Corbin? Wait.
not being there, just hold it. I don't
What are you thinking? What are you thinking about clever?
Clever is, it's mean that means like, just mean like lucky. It's like lucky that you can get like stuff out of tails.
Okay, so we'll see if that idea about clever fits in here. What did you think about with clever?
I know about clever means curious.
Oh, interesting. Well, we'll see if that's the way that they're using that. We'll see if that makes sense, because they're talking about clever tales in here. Now, take a couple of moments now and just have a look through the book, introduce it to yourself, see what things you're noticing.
Did I just... It's
Just
from
think-
the title.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? There's the same photo. Ooh. What are you noticing?
I noticed that for lizards, they use their tail to hold on, and these ones, they use their tail to swim.
Yeah. Take a look through there. Look at all those different animals that are in there. Ooh, that one's kind of scary looking, isn't it?
Yeah, that's scorpion. Scorpion.
Ooh.
Now this one at my house from Moto. The tails. Sometimes I go too. Corbin. It's from Moto, but I don't want to say the whole thing. Scorpion. And then Miss Debra.
The index.
Miss Debra. Does scorpion's tail are poisonous?
We'll find out when we get there. We'll read and find out.
Oops, let's see here. So if I were with you, I would stop and say turn and talk to your partners, but I'm not. So let me kind of go through some of the observations that I have when I watch this video. So some of the things that I noticed from the kids, one is that they're really comfortable considering their background knowledge for ideas about the topic and vocabulary within the book. So you see the kids naming the animals and talking through some of the things that they know about how animals might use their tails. They respond to and really use the photographs to engage with the text. That really launches them in. The photographs are one of those, I think, text features that we sometimes sort of take for granted, but really powerful photographs draw kids in and allow them to support, or it supports them to start engaging with the text. As a group, they're working on not raising their hands. So that was a really challenging, piece for them, because one of the things that happens when we begin to try to have conversations where kids are beginning to negotiate their way in and kind of run that conversation, is it's very easy for them to get really frustrated. So one of the things that we're working on is what can we do so that we don't get frustrated within that discussion. And so one of those ways that I'm going to support that is through setting up those talk and collaboration goals. at the very beginning, just to reassure them that they're all going to be heard and they're all going to have opportunities to share their thinking. Because it's kind of frustrating, I think, especially when we change the culture, where kids are normally, they raise their hands and that's how they let the teacher know that they're thinking and they've got an idea and they're, right and smart. And what we're doing is we're supporting them to learn to work and work together through this. One of the things that I always try to think about in an introduction is using broad questions, so that we can initiate some thinking around the story ideas and vocabulary, but not asking questions that are going to be so specific that kids aren't having to do the thinking work. And one of the things I'm so proud of myself when I watch this, because it's so hard not to answer their questions. So one of the things I try and do is just acknowledge the question or acknowledge the ideas that are coming out, but not really confirming and answering with that, because what I want them to do is learn to rely on the text and the others around the group, and not everything being about getting ideas from the teacher. So one thing that you may notice if you watch this is that I chose not to set the reading focus yet. It's a new book for us, and we're just coming into the text, and we're going to read, if we had continued on, we would read the introduction of the text, and at that point I set up them noticing how the text is laid out, this organizational structure of the 2 pages on each animal and the continuing on through. I set that up after they had read the introduction, not before. So in the next section, we're going to do some thinking about their reading and their discussing. So this conversation, and we're picking it up just a couple minutes later after the kids have gotten through the introduction part. If you want to see that, this video is on Okapi's website. But I'm picking it up when we begin to have a discussion around the first animal in the book.
Turn over and let's take a look at the first animal that they're going to talk to us about.
Crocodile.
Now, how did you figure out so fast that it was crocodile?
Miss Debra.
Talk to us. Tell us on that. How did you find that? I'm sorry, Aiden. I'm sorry. Aiden, how did you find that out?
It's because it has the name and I knew it from here, so that was the same. So I knew this, so I was thinking fast, but I didn't make a mistake. So I said that was a crocodile, and that seems like the same thing.
Absolutely.
I know because of the crocodile's pictures.
Now, sometimes kids think it's alligator, but wasn't it helpful that they put us a label there to help us know it was crocodile and not alligator? Now, take a look at that alligator's tail. Look at the tail. What do you notice about his tail?
It's spikes.
Got some spikies on it, doesn't it?
I know why crocodile, because alligators don't have those pointy things.
You don't think so? Now, we're going to go on here and we're going to have to read and find out now how this alligator uses his tail to get food.
Crocodile.
Excuse me. Yeah, the crocodile. Did I say alligator?
Yeah.
Silly me. So you go read how this crocodile uses his tail.
Crocodile
And read it into your head.
grabs crocodile and his head to eat. Is he a bird? It's in the mouth. An animal comes to the water to drink. The crocodile cleans itself and knows the animal's odor. Then the crocodile grabs the animal with its teeth.
All right. So Corbin, talk to us about what did you find out about how this crocodile uses its tail to get its food? And we're all going to look at Corbin and listen to his thinking.
The crocodile uses its tail to catch animals.
How does he do that? What did you find out there? Well, let's go back and let's look and see. What did you find out, Jocelyn?
When an animal comes to drink, it swings its tail and grabs it. When an animal is coming, they stay very still for the animals to think it's a statue, and then the crocodile scares them, and then they go eat them.
So some of the things that I notice when I'm looking at this portion of the video is that the students are really using a variety of strategies. They use their background on the topic to help them interpret the photographs. They use the labels to help them interpret the photographs. They use the photographs to help them think about the vocabulary that's there in the text. And they're really beginning to integrate, because you can hear them having conversations about the information that's there in the photograph as well as the information that's there in the text. They're learning to put their thinking into their own words. I mean, I just always appreciate when I listen to Santi talking about how that alligator is laying there just, or excuse me, crocodile, I'll do it again. You notice me continuing to use the word alligator even after I point out that it's crocodile in the label. But him thinking about how the crocodile lies there like a statue. So he's beginning to use his own vocabulary and language to talk about the text. But at the same time learning to use text evidence to support their thinking. So they're kind of beginning to learn to do that. And really articulating how they know something. You know, and I'm asking them, like, how did you figure that out? How did you know that? So that they're beginning to, to notice their own thinking, that metacognitive part of the work. And then one of the things I think that you start to see a hint of there is how they're beginning to talk among themselves. So if I give them enough time to start to process it, they'll begin talking those conversations together. What you might not have heard as much about is I'm using what's called a talk, read, reflect model. So we're not doing a book walk all the way through the book and then coming back and reading. We're talking a little bit about the pages, then they're going to read those pages, and then we say, what did you find out when you were reading? So that talk, read, reflect model, and we use that throughout the text. We talk about each of the animals. Because of the structure of how this book was laid out, we were using that model on 2 pages at a time. But what you may find is as you move on into texts that are a little bit lengthier, is maybe using that model across several pages of text, because we want kids to be taking on larger and larger chunks of text as we go on. One of the things that my role is noticing and naming what strategies they're using. As Peter Johnson says, when we notice and name what kids are doing, it helps them understand what's effective in what they are doing in the work, and really inviting them to, to share their thinking. But one of my roles is supporting kids who sometimes it's a little challenging to negotiate their ways into conversation. So I have to make sure that there's space for those kiddos to come in. Jocelyn, she's surrounded by some talkers there, and so I have to help her to find her way into that thinking and into that conversation. I'm asking broad, probing questions. What did you find out? How did you figure that out? What made you think that? Those kinds of questions. And then thinking about the work that they're doing and holding that in my head so that when I get to closure, I can bring some of that work back. So let's take a little look at what the closure of this lesson looks like.
Take a look at the end of our book. And Santiago noticed this when we were first looking through the book. Santiago, can you talk to them about what you were thinking here?
That I never know that there can be an index at the end of every book.
Sometimes we see a table of contents at the beginning and it will have a list of things. And here the index, it has a list of all the animals.
Miss Debra,
What are these numbers mean?
What are those numbers, do you think?
It means the page we just read. The pages what it's on.
here. They're mixed up.
How are they mixed up?
Yeah, because 4 don't belong. Because they have 2 pages and there's 2 pages of it, and then this one goes 4, 10, 14, 8, 12, 6, and it doesn't make sense.
Yes, it does. No, these are the pages what it's on. The arrow, the pages. Yeah, so it doesn't have to make sense. It doesn't have to.
It has to make sense.
Like you said, those numbers are those steps. Like steps.
I know why it doesn't make sense.
You're thinking the pages? So if we go to page 10, which animal will we see?
Jaguar.
And if we go to page 8, which animal will we see?
Scorpion.
And what about page 6?
We'll see a whale. Kill a whale.
Now, wonder why they're in the order they're in. Any ideas about why the crocodile's first and then the jaguar? Because that's not who was second in the book, right? Go ahead.
They just put it like at the end so they know what page they're on.
That's so helpful, because if we're at the end of the book and we just want to find the snake page really quickly, how would we find it?
It's on this. We could see the number.
We'd have to find the right page. We have to find
Number
Snake's
12.
name.
I already found
And it's on page 12, isn't it?
Alright.
So close up your books. Wow, you did amazing thinking work
12?
today. You were noticing, at first we started really looking and just thinking about what we noticed in the pictures.
Mine was that
in these
one.
photographs. You got very excited when you saw these different animals. And then you were doing such a nice job reading over here and figuring out how this animal could use its tail to help it catch food. And Santiago, you did a very important thing right here. When it didn't make sense to you, you said, I don't understand that. That doesn't make sense. And then when you kept talking and kept talking and kept talking, you figured it all out on your own. You listened to some other ideas, then you started thinking if you could say it, and you figured it out. Can you tell us how that jaguar uses its tail to catch food?
It takes a little bit of its tail, and if because the fish thinks that the water in the tip of the tail, so the fish try to eat it. And the jaguar eats it.
Eats the fish up, right? So see, when he got some other ideas from other people, when it didn't make sense, and he kept thinking and kept thinking, and he figured it out. That's such important reader work, to know when it doesn't make sense in your head. And I saw on your face, because you said, you had a little frown and you were like, that doesn't make sense. And then you kept
Like
thinking
what?
and kept thinking till you worked it
Like
out.
what?
That's important. He reread, he got some ideas from you, he reread the page, and he figured it all out.
So some of the things that I noticed the students doing in this closure, one is they're really, they're wondering about this unknown element. Like, they know it's called an index, but a lot of the ways that an index are used are kind of confusing when you first see them, but they're generating hypotheses about this unknown text feature and like how it's really working. And one of the things that I absolutely love in this ending is how they are discussing and responding to others' ideas. I think at this point in the lesson, they're beginning to really attend to what the other kids are saying. So you see them, agreeing and disagreeing all the way through that particular little clip. My role in the lesson or in the closure, is really noticing what has happened through the lesson. And so what I tried to do was to bring in an idea from Santi that he mentioned that right off the bat when we were just looking through the book, and he noticed that it had an index. But rather than going off on an index there, I decided to bring it in the closure. So I'm bringing in an idea that one of the other students has attended to, so that I can focus that discussion. And then I'm asking them to explore their hypotheses rather than me standing there and teaching about indexes. Let them explore their hypotheses. One of the things that I tried to do is extend a little bit with probing, but I asked them, why do you think they're in the order they're in? But it's one of those ideas where the kids weren't really responding to that question, and so I had to just let that go. And one of the things that, again, I'm a little proud of, is that I resisted teaching, because I was not prepared to talk and teach directly about an index. And anytime that I want to teach about something, I don't want to just show and tell in one example. I want to have several examples. I personally believe that the teachable moment doesn't mean you teach it in the moment. I think it means that you recognize that it needs to be taught, and then you prepare and you think about when and where am I going to teach that and how am I going to work with that. So I resist teaching in that moment because I really wasn't prepared to show them multiple examples of indexes so that they could begin to notice the pattern. That probably needs to occur in shared reading, not in a guided reading lesson. And then my work is also noticing and naming the role of collaboration and how it helps in our thinking. And Santiago, and the earlier part of the discussion, he'd had a real confusion on one of the pages. And I always think what a celebration it was that we were having this discussion, and that he felt comfortable and confident enough to say, I don't understand this, and recognizing that. And that's such an important moment in the lesson that I really need to make sure that I'm noticing and naming that and helping the kids to see how collaborating helped him to work towards clarifying. I don't think he's quite exactly there, but I think if you ever watch the series of videos, as we get on into the work, he is making sense of the text as we continue on and thinking about this. So in terms of guided reading in the structure, that introduction, we typically want an introduction with the book to be around 5 to 8 minutes. We don't want it to go too long, and so sometimes what happens is we stretch that introduction too long. But I'm going to talk in just a moment about what we do if we're going to be using a text where we do need to spend more time in an intro. But again, I have to set up the talk work, the reading work, and the orienting to the ideas in the book. The reading and discussion part here, I used a talk, read, reflect model. That's typically around 10 to 12 minutes. It's not straight reading for several minutes and then discussing. It's reading a little, just talking, reading, reflecting on a couple pages, talking, reading, reflecting on another section of text, and so on as we work through. And then closure is a minute or two where we reflect on the reading work, we reflect on the talk work that occurred. And so that's sort of approximating the timings of a guided reading lesson. You know, it's around 20, so or minutes. But one of the things that you start seeing as you get into these texts that are longer is that these guided reading sessions, you're going to use a single text over multiple days. So we'll talk a little bit about the timing and the approximations that'll happen during that lesson. So in the first session, like what we've seen just here on video, our introduction, you may have an introduction to the text overall and then an introduction to today's reading portion. So when I'm starting in this new text, like the Clever Tales book, I need to give the kids time to explore the entire book and just take a look through it. In a nonfiction text, one of the things that they start seeing is kind of how the text is organized and noticing the photographs and noticing what they recognize and know about the topic. In fiction texts, we won't necessarily have the kids look across the entire text like they do in nonfiction, but we would want them to think about the genre. We might think about using the table of contents to help us anticipate storyline. Or we might have the kids read a little bit of the text, maybe the first page or half page or a page or two, and think about what they're figuring out about this text already. Maybe even going in and thinking about, what can you tell about the characters? What can you tell about the type of fiction that it is? Is it historical, realistic, or science fiction? All of that can be discerned from the first few pages or sometimes even the first few sentences within a book. So that might be what the introduction looks like. But it's going to be, around 10 minutes or so. And then the reading and discussing of the text, an 8 to 10 minute or so, and then a closure on the lesson. Okay, so every lesson is going to have an introduction, reading, discussing, and a closure. Subsequent sessions, so the next day or the next day or two when we're meeting with the kids again, this lesson also has to have an introduction. And one of the things that I try and think about is the introduction in these subsequent sessions is short. It's not going to be nearly as long as the introduction in a first session. So what I want to do is review the previous session's ideas. And review doesn't mean ask a question. So I'm not going to say, what did we talk about yesterday? Because that can end up taking 10 more minutes as kids are trying to figure out, okay, what all did we talk about yesterday? So I think about teachers in this moment doing just a very short summary statement about what we talked about yesterday, so that we can then begin introducing them to today's reading. So we're going to read this next piece and figure out XXX. And so then in the reading and discussing of today's portion, you see if you compare these, that in the first session, the introduction was much longer than it is on subsequent sessions. And the reading and discussing portion on the subsequent session may end up being a little bit longer because we don't do as much of an introduction in that section. But we have to have a closure on this lesson as well. And so one of the things that we don't want to do is our closure to be this. Okay, we have to stop right now, put your bookmark in, and off you go. Like, we don't want to have that kind of closure. We want to have a reflective closure that gives us an opportunity to think about the thinking work that kids did on that particular day. So that's the purpose of that closure. And one of the things that using a text over these multiple days in this way does is it supports us as we are getting to bigger ideas. One of the big concepts that you have to hold on to in a guided reading lesson is that the teacher's role is not the director of everything. It's more of the facilitator. So coming back to the quote that Richard Allington and Rachel Gabriel shared here, this was, I think, in our first session when we talked about the role of talk. They just remind us that a conversation with peers improves comprehension and engagement, and that we have to make sure that the conversation is not retelling and recalling as much as it's about analyzing and commenting and comparing and really, really digging in and thinking about what they have read. And so to do that kind of facilitation, to support that kind of thinking, we have to begin to shift the way that we question and talk. So one of the things, we've all heard of wait time. And so one of the things I think about is that when I give kids that silence, that space, I give them time to think. And that's one of the things that we want to make sure that we honor, is slowing our lessons down in some ways so that kids are able to do the kind of deep thinking work that we want. And then when students do share, that we begin to explore their thinking. So I quite often start with a question like, what are you thinking, so that they can explain what they think. There's no information in that question for kids to turn into a sentence and hand back to me. So I'm getting a better assessment of what they're attending to and what they're ignoring. Then I'm going to explore what they're saying. So whatever they say, I'm going to say something like, tell us more about that, or, tell us some more, or say more about that, so that it gets kids to expand on their thinking. And then following up with, well, what makes you think that? So that's going to give us a context oftentimes. So if I say, they say something, I say, what makes you think that? And they say, oh, well, my mom told me that, or I saw it in a movie, or whatever. That's going to come out when I say, what makes you think that? Then I can ask for what in the text got you thinking about that. So I might say something like, oh, what in the text got you thinking about what your mom shared, or got you thinking about that movie, so that I can connect that background knowledge or background source of information to the text that we're reading together. And then one of the things I want to also think about is, how do I facilitate the other kids to think about what someone else has shared, considering another person's perspective. So I'm going to say something like, what do you think about so-and-so's idea? And if you say this and kids give you the deer in the headlight look, where they're like, oh, I didn't hear that, then we support them to ask the student, can you say your idea again? So rather than us repeating it, we ask the kids to ask each other to repeat those ideas. And that gives us a way of supporting kids as they're coming into all these different kinds of thinking. As a teacher, it requires that you really do understand that comprehension doesn't happen at one point. Comprehension is not the thing we do after we read. It's the process that's taking place before, during, and after all the work that we do. So within a guided reading lesson, comprehension is occurring all the way through the lesson. It's not that conversation after they read. And we're making sure that kids are thinking at literal, interpretive, and analytical, critical kinds of levels of understanding. The thinking within, beyond, and about a text is really crucial. What we want to guard against, as Marie-Claire says here, and I think she's citing Piaget, is that you don't want to do for the child what they're learning to do for themselves. What we want to do is provide the space and the opportunity and the time for kids to be able to do that thinking work for themselves. So after the guided reading lesson, one of the things we know is that comprehension doesn't end the moment that you close your book. It's something that we want to make sure that kids have the opportunity to continue to think and think and think about as we go through. So one of the things that I try and think a lot about is making sure that kids have opportunities to reread the books, to come back in and have more of those conversations together. One of the biggest challenges sometimes as teachers is that we share books with other teachers. And we often feel compelled to take that book back to the book room, take that book set back so that someone else can use it. Or we might hold on to it and make sure that we're giving another group opportunity to read in that book. But one of the things we know is that through rereading, kids are learning to orchestrate and solidify their abilities as readers. So that rereading the book is one of the most important things you can do after guided reading. It's much more important than putting the book back into the book room. Another way that I can work with kids after the book is giving them opportunities to write, to extend their thinking. On the left here, you see a Blackline Master that came in the lesson plans for this book, Clever Tales. And so it's asking kids to write their thinking about the animal whose tail they see there in the photograph. But one of the things I always try and think about is that really powerful assessments like this, I can use that and extend that idea. So imagine we've read Clever Tales and I use this as an assessment, but now I'm going to put kids in the position of researching if they're interested in doing this kind of follow-up. And so they could research other animals and see if they can find out about the tails of an animal and how an animal uses its tail. Because at the beginning of the lesson, we talked about all these other uses for animals' tails. And so kids could do some extended research and writing on that. That could go into a center. That could be something that the whole group does, or it could be something that I offer up as an opportunity for kids who are interested in doing that follow-up work. One of the really key things when you have text, though, that exist as pairs is that you can have lessons where kids can do some thinking and talking about the pair to synthesize their understandings. And so these particular books, Clever Tales you saw, this has a fiction piece that goes with it. Okapi, in their Flying Start collection, every book has a fiction and a nonfiction text that pair. And they're connected through key concepts. So they're not just about the same topic, but these ideas run through both books. So in these particular books, the idea that some animals use their tails to help them get food, and the structure of the animal's tail relates to the function. How do they use it to help them get food? And so in Clever Tales, we see, for example, here, this jaguar who he lives near the water, and he sticks his tail out and he taps the top of the water. And it makes the fish think that an insect has landed. And then when the fish comes up to eat the insect, the cat grabs the fish and eats it. I just think that's absolutely fascinating. Well, in the monkey's tail, one of the things that we see is that little monkey is not satisfied with his tail, and he decides that he wants to try out other animals' tails. So he sneaks up on these different animals and he switches tails with them. And so in the process of this, the monkey is thinking about how that animal's tail works and why it does or does not work well for a monkey. And so they're using that kind of information that they learned in nonfiction to help them think about the fiction text as well. And so we had a particular lesson where we came back together and we were thinking about the pair and coming together. So let's hear a little of their conversation.
Why do animals have different types of tails, do you think? Different kinds of tails?
So they could catch animals in different ways.
Talk a little bit about an animal that you know in their tail.
The jaguar tips the tip of his tail in the water, and the fish thinks.
Can you show us how that works? So here's the water, and here's the jaguar tail, and what's he do?
Put the tip of his tail. He's tapping the water.
And why does he do that?
So he could catch fish.
How does that help him catch a fish?
He's shaking the fish that the fish thinks there's an insect landing on top of the water, and then they try to eat it, then the jaguar eats it.
That is so clever, isn't it?
We already
clever and
said
kind of
that
tricky. He did, yes, we did. Now, do all animals use their tail to catch? To catch food or get food?
Not cats. No, because some animals don't use their tails to catch food because these lizards hang upside down. They only eat the branches. Yeah. And scorpion only eats insects or mice. Cute mice. And then the monkey has like two tails. Dogs don't use their tails to eat their mouth.
Why is the jaguar's tail long and skinny, do you think?
So he could tip the tip of his tail in the water.
So he can way out into the water? Now, what about that shape of that crocodile's tail? What about the crocodile's tail helps him?
Sharpies.
And how does that help him to catch his food?
When somebody jumps on the trampoline and they go really far, they might land on the sharp part and they might die.
But let's think about what the book told us. How did the crocodile use his tail to help him get food? Hold on a moment. Aiden's going to share with us. Keep going. Tell us your thinking.
He stays very still. I noticed something. It says it lies very still.
Oh, so stay back with the crocodile.
Like the snake.
Oh,
Like the snake. Like the snake.
Uh-huh.
Because every time it lies very still, it's almost the same as the jaguar because if a fish came in, he might eat it. And when the crocodile stays still and a duck comes over, it just slaps it. It's not a duck, it's a fish. A fish, it's a duck as a bone, and it's like poison or something. It like pieces slaps out really hard, maybe a break a bone, and you can't like flap or something, swim, and the crocodile just ate it.
So when you think about what the kids were doing in this lesson, one of the things that I think about is that they're learning to articulate their thinking a lot more easily, even across this lesson. I think they get more comfortable with that. And they talk a little more readily without waiting for me to direct the conversation. And even though that they are sometimes talking on top of each other, I really want them to feel comfortable about coming in. So I'm not trying to control that part. We'll work to learn how to negotiate our ways in. They use the text to support their thinking. You see them going back into the text and noticing how they're doing some of that work. And they're adding on to each other's ideas. So when you hear Ahmed say, and he's adding right on to Aiden's thinking. And so, again, one of the things that I try not to do too much of is directing the conversation so that kids are getting opportunities to practice negotiating their way into the conversation. And so, it gives them more experience with that. My questions are more at the conceptual level when we get into this work, like noticing like those broader kinds of questions and bigger conceptual questions, like about how the animal uses its tail, how different animals use their tails to catch food. And then probing questions to expand on the ideas when they share. And thinking about coming back to ideas from other discussions. By this point, we would have read the nonfiction and the fiction, and so ways I can come back to ideas from other discussions of the text as well. And one of the things that I try and do too is if they share ideas out that really are not necessarily connected to the text, then my role will be redirecting them in. So when they start talking about trampolines and animals jumping on the trampoline, redirecting them back into ideas that aren't really text connected, and helping them explore their thinking even more. The role of connected text over time really supports deeper thinking. It helps kids develop greater comprehension on a topic. It develops a range of strategies as kids are working within texts that have different purposes and structures and features. But as they're reading across the same text, they're running into concepts and vocabulary that support them for this greater understanding. They also increase their ability to talk about a topic from different perspectives, given the different text types that they're working in. And it supports them in writing because they're seeing and experiencing texts that are written in a variety of text types. And it offers opportunities for their language to move from exploratory to more presentational. They're thinking about what they understand as they construct meaning. And then the more that they consider the thinking of others and think about, what they're trying to say and how they're trying to say it, they move into that more presentational kind of thinking. All of that really supports kids as they're developing as I always think of them as sort of like these multi-layered readers, so that they're not just text decoders, but they're also text participants and they're text users and text analysts. And we talked a lot about these 4 different resources in our session on Focus on Learners. So if that's one that you haven't watched yet, you can go back. But thinking about all these different roles that kids are experiencing, so that as they grow into this intellectual life that surrounds them, we're supporting them to develop and see reading as this really powerful tool that they have for understanding their world. So any questions that you have, if you want to go ahead and send those in. One of the things that I'm learning as I'm doing each of these is that some of the questions that people are asking from one, I'm adding them in and into the information on the next one that comes along. The timing of a lesson is one of the things that people are often curious about. And I think about the timing as being it's sort of, I think, the last piece that we get good at as teachers. I think about understanding your intention and your purpose, and then that your timing comes probably not in the very beginning. So it's trying to think about how we're trying to support kids to make meaning. So I'm going to pause right here with questions because I didn't have any questions that came through. So in our series now, we've got 2 left. We've got one on March 30th and one on March 31st. We're going to be looking at fluent readers who are in grades 2 through 5, and then advanced readers in 3 through 5. And again, I just put grade levels on there to help with thinking about some specifics, and you're welcome to join any or all of these as we go along. So thank you so much for participating with me today. And again, if you have any other topics that you would like to think together around, please let Pat Eastman know, and we will put some more webinars together for you. I hope you can join me next week. Take care, wash your hands, and I'll be safe.